I had one of my peers say to me, he said, I don't care if you were like the top candidate at Gagetown. You didn't earn it. You shouldn't be here. And nobody wants you here. And there you are by yourself, like this is week 2 in the regiment, having a beer after work with the guys. And it's like, like, what do you say to that?
Hi, I'm Shannon Busta, and welcome to Season 2 of For Her Country, a podcast produced by the True Patriot Love Foundation and the Captain Nicola Goddard Fund. Over the course of this series, we'll explore lessons in leadership from inspirational female leaders from across Canada's armed forces, all in honor of fallen Canadian military hero, Captain Nicola Goddard. The clip you just heard is from a discussion with retired Lieutenant Colonel Anne Reiffenstein. Anne was one of Canada's first female artillery officers, and she faced a number of challenges in the early years of gender integration in the Army. Women have played an integral role in Canada's military for more than a century. In World War I, thousands of nurses contributed to the war effort, and in World War II, our military was forever changed when we established our first women's forces, which enabled women to serve in uniform for the first time in Canadian history. And serve they did. They filled a number of roles during the war, including mechanics, parachute riggers, wireless operators, clerks, and photographers. But for most of our history, women were not allowed in combat roles. Things began to change in the 80s after Parliament passed the Canadian Human Rights Act and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Finally, in 1989, women were permitted to take on combat roles in the Canadian Armed Forces. There was, however, still one barrier that remained in the Navy. It wasn't until the year 2000 that women were finally allowed to serve on submarines. Over the past 30 years, Canada's Armed Forces has been working not only to lift barriers to entry, but to actively encourage women to enlist. 1989 might sound pretty recent to some of you. It did to me when I first started working on this podcast. But one of the more surprising things that I've learned is that many of our allies have only begun allowing women into frontline positions relatively recently, meaning Canada is quite literally decades ahead of our allies when it comes to gender integration. And as we'll learn today, that integration has not always been a smooth process. So as we've learned more about Canada opening up combat roles to women, we wanted to get a sense of what those early days were really like for the trailblazers who were among the first women to join the forces and help it evolve. And so, our guest today is one of those trailblazers, retired Lieutenant Colonel Anne Reiffenstein. Anne had a long and successful career in the military, and the work she did has helped pave the way for generations of women to follow. Anne also had the opportunity to instruct and to mentor Captain Nicola Goddard, and we'll hear a bit about their friendship today. And we reach Anne in Belgium today. Anne, thank you so much for joining us today. It's an honor to have you on the program. I'd like to start off our conversation as I often do, and that's by asking, how did you find your way into a career in the military?
It was a long time ago, right? So I joined in 1989, and I joined right after the human rights decision where they opened up the combat arms to women. That implies that I knew, or infers that I knew what I was getting into. Yeah, not a Scooby. Like, I had no idea what I was doing. It was just like, oh, I'm going to go into the army and I'm going to run around and yell, follow me, boys. And people would do that. I'd watched movies like everybody else. I've been in cadets and I've been in the reserves. And I thought, oh, well, I really enjoyed those experiences. I'll really enjoy the regular force. I had dropped out of university. The education thing at that point wasn't working for me. I was doing all sorts of things. So I thought, hey, the Army's a great way to get out and see the world. I wanted to have an adventure. And that's what I figured, that if I joined the Army, and particularly if I joined the combat arms, I would have that adventure.
That seems like a pretty bold decision to be making at that time. Going in, were you thinking about the fact that you were going to be one of the first women in combat arms?
I was. I knew there wouldn't be a lot of women. I just actually thought there would be more as time went on. I really didn't have a sound understanding of what I was signing up to do, but I was very insistent that that's what I wanted to do. At the recruiters, they basically said, do you really want to do this? And they brought in actually a couple of infantry officers from the local battalion to convince me not to do this. And I was like, no, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. I was working, I'd worked in predominantly male environments before, and I was working construction at that point in time. So I thought, oh, how different could it be? Yeah, pretty different. But hey.
And so those early years, what were they actually like for you?
One, you don't know what you don't know, right? So I had no frame of reference. Like there was no, so you didn't see anybody else doing this. So it was really good in one ways because I was kind of forging my own path, and there was no one to like, say, oh, you can't do that or you can't do that. However, it was really hard at times because I had thought I thought the training was going to be the hard part. So if you got through the training, everything else was going to be okay, because once you're qualified and you showed, demonstrated that you could do the job, then all the rest of the stuff shouldn't matter. And that really wasn't what happened. It was a little bit, there was a lot of people who were very, very unhappy to see me show up at the unit. They didn't want women wrecking the way it had always been. It introduced something new to the dynamic that a lot of people were really uncomfortable with. And this is after a lot of reflection. I certainly didn't have this understanding when I was going through it. At the time, it was a bit lonely. I was very isolated. I was in Shiloh, Manitoba. There weren't very many women around at all. Certainly not a lot of single women, not a lot of women my age. And I was kind of on my own a great deal. My peers really weren't terribly accepting, and the soldiers and the senior NCOs on the whole were really great. They did care. They cared how you did your job, and on the whole were quite supportive. But my peers, not so much.
That sounds like it must have been really lonely. What did the day-to-day interactions look and feel like with your colleagues?
So there was a fair amount of initial harassment, but the difficulty is there was no normative for me to compare with. Like, was this harassment because I was a junior officer, and all junior officers are treated with some, certainly at that time, were treated with some, like kind of, yeah, they're there, and played tricks on him, kind of sent out to do silly things. And, like it's just part of the ritual of fitting in, right? Growing up in the regiment. But there were times when it was really hard. Like there were times when it was very specific. I had one of my peers say to me, he said, I don't care if you were like the top candidate at Gagetown. You didn't earn it. You shouldn't be here. And nobody wants you here. And there you are by yourself, like this is week 2 in the regiment, having a beer after work with the guys. And it's like, like, what do you say to that?
Oh my God, that's devastating. How did you recover?
Well, you know what? I was really, really. I just thought they needed to be convinced, So just work hard, do your stuff, don't make a fuss, make sure you don't bring up any of that female stuff, make sure you're just one of the guys. And it actually took me about 18 months after I arrived at the unit to really understand that there's nothing I could do that would make them change their minds. And once that happened, that was actually, I know it sounds awful, but it wasn't. It was actually a little bit, it was kind of like, okay, I can just be me and do me, And I was, and I did. And you know what? I found my groove. Like I found, a space that I was pretty comfortable with. A friend of mine, I had a roommate, she was female. It was, I had someone to hang out with and watch movies with on a Friday night kind of thing. So it was just, it was okay. It was okay. And I didn't know any better. Like I look back, and I go, oh, why did I not quit? But it was a different army then. It was a very different army then. It was very old army, not new army. And new army is way better.
So obviously you didn't quit. Can you take us through a quick timeline of your career?
So I had kind of 2 stages to my career. My first 15 years, I think, in the military, I would say it was very field and operational focus. So I was either in units or on bases, or so I did the roles in the regiment, right? All the junior officer roles in the artillery. So that goes from being a gunline officer where you're running around shooting guns to a forward observation officer, calling in fire, an adjutant, so basically being the HR person for the regiment, you know, um, being a battery commander. So I had a subunit under my command, that I was able to direct that fire and support one of the infantry battalions. So I did all of those roles. I was with 1 Canadian Division headquarters in Kingston, which was a deployable headquarters. So we went on a number of deployments in the US and overseas. And then about 2005, at the end of my subunit command, and my kids were 3 and 5. And my husband and I are both in the military. And by that point, that was kind of kids first now. Kids first. We had a couple of really tough years. I look back at now and go, oh, what were you thinking? I look at the kids and go, oh, doesn't look like any permanent damage was done. Like they seem okay. So, so 2005, we kind of I moved to what I would call the institutional military. So I went to the Royal Military College and I was on staff there, first as a division commander and then the chief instructor. From there, I went to Staff College in Toronto, did a year of professional development and did a master's degree. Then I went to Ottawa, and there I worked in strategic resource management and the chief of program under the vice chief of defense staff. So I was working in, business planning and organization establishment and sexy MBA stuff like that. Then I did my MBA. And then I was really fortunate. I got sent down to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, to be the Canadian exchange officer and teach at Army University, the U.S. Command and General Staff College. I spent 3 years doing that, and that was super fun. And then I came back, worked at the Canadian Forces College, doing directing staff, doing some lecturing, and then some curriculum development, and then I retired. So the first half was very operationally focused, and the second half was very institutionally focused. So more organizational structure, corporate type of things in business terms.
It really sounds like you've had a ton of exposure to the many sides of the armed forces.
I've seen a lot of it. And I'm interested in a lot of it. Like it's really been fascinating watching the leadership change and evolve, and certainly leadership, how it's changed at the the operational level, the field force level, and actually at the institutional level. And the changes have been really, really dramatic. Like it's not a small change. These are big changes in a generation, and it's really fascinating.
And can you tell us a bit more about that? What have those changes actually meant for the troops on the ground?
It was a lot less. It went from a very patriarchal, very top heavy, decisions made here, don't question, go, very directive style of leadership, very directive style of going forward. Don't ask dumb questions. I'll tell you what to think, kind of thing. To very consultative, very engaged, very two-way on the leadership. So the followers started being taken into consideration. And the rise of this in the military professional development side of the house is the idea of the strategic corporal. The strategic corporal is that the guy on the ground is the one who's going to make a strategic decision. He can have a strategic impact. And I think when people started to understand that, they started to realize that not only could he have an impact, but he could really have a positive impact if we engage, if we talk, if we get that in place. And so I'm not saying that it's not a hierarchical institution anymore. It most definitely is. And I'm not saying that it's not risk averse, because it is. But I would suggest that the leadership are far more open to outside ideas, and it's much less insular. I remember when in the early 90s, we just wanted people to leave us alone so we could do our military thing. Like there was no interaction with the Canadian public. There was no understanding or anything else like that. And now it's just so much more engaged, and I think that's a real step in the positive direction. And women, I think that's a lot of that. The Canadian Forces taking a real effort to reflect what the Canadian public looks like. That's a huge step. To understand the value of that, I think has really, really changed the nature of leadership.
That sounds like a change that many organizations are grappling with right now, figuring out how to better reflect the world that they're operating in. So I'd like to rewind things a little bit and dig into the first half of your career. I'd love to hear about your first deployment experience.
I didn't do a lot of deployments, just because time and place. It wasn't because I didn't want to go, and it wasn't because I wasn't selected. It just, I wasn't in the right spot at the right time. So I went to Cyprus with the regiment, and that was under the old army rules. And that is the United Nations peacekeeping mission that we involved in. We were like the 58th tour, Op Snow Goose 58. So that tells you something about the stability of that particular mission.
Can I just pause you there? Can you give us a quick overview of what Canada was doing in Cyprus? And you mentioned that you were on the 58th tour. Can you help us understand what having so many tours says about a mission?
Sure. So the United Nations went into Cyprus, which is a partitioned island in the Mediterranean, Cypriot Turk on one side and Cypriot Greek on the other. And there have been continuous issues. And then in the early 70s, a war broke out between the two parties, and they ended up coming to a steady state where the island was separated by what they call the Green Line. And it's basically, literally on the map, a green kind of stripe that goes through the center of the island, separating the two populations. And so didn't matter where you were originally from, the Greeks were on the south side and the Cypriot Turks were on the north side. And, there was support from the mainland Greece and support from mainland Turkey for both of these two factions. The United Nations went in and separated them, and there were contingents of troops that rotated through to ensure the integrity of the zone of separation in order to prevent any further violence from breaking out.
And how old were you on this deployment?
26.
So pretty young.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. This was my first kind of big go. I was not allowed to go on the line as a platoon commander. That would have been kind of the normal fit for me, but they didn't think that the Turks would negotiate with a woman. They just assumed that a woman wouldn't be able to do that job. So I went in as the transport officer initially, and then I became the information officer, which in UN speak means the intelligence officer.
So how did the deployment end up going for you?
It was really interesting. It was a lot of fun. The level of harassment was fabulously high in terms of sexual harassment. Not from the local population, but from my peers and from various things. It was like a lot of that was really weird. But that's the way it went. It was a good learning experience, because it really wasn't particularly dangerous. Like, my husband was on tour at the same time. This is before we met, and he was in Croatia. So I was reading the reports about Croatia, and that was actually not a happy mission. People were actually shooting at you and doing things to you. Whereas in Cyprus, no one was, like, the worst thing that could happen is, you were drinking a fair bit. So you had to watch out, so you could show up to work in the morning.
You're in Cyprus and you're 26 years old and you're being harassed a lot. Can you give us a sense of your state of mind at this time? Are you still happy with your choice to be in the military?
Yeah, I'm still having fun. Like, it's still fun. And you have to understand, there was no framework of understanding for this, right? There were no harassment regulations. There was nobody saying sexual harassment is bad in the workplace. There was nobody saying any of these things. I didn't know. I just thought it was annoying and pestering. And the best thing is to come up with a no touching, no touchy. So I didn't do casual touching of people and didn't allow, like, I kind of tried to put a little bubble around myself. I tried to participate in things as much as I could, but I kept getting injured. Like, I had my sinus cavity and my cheekbone broken when I was in Cyprus. So that was
Ooh, how did that
interesting.
happen?
I got punched in the face at a mess function. It
Pardon me.
happened. Yeah,
Wow.
well, but that, again, that's old army, right? Because that's what we did. It wasn't unusual for fighting and brawls, and it was all good natured. When you see guys get together and they kind of tussle, and that's what it was. Except, one of the guys I worked with, I learned a lot there, because I had a boss that sat there and said to me, hey, it took me aside and said to me, you know what, you need to remember. He goes, how big are you? And I said, well, I'm 5'5". And he goes, okay, so all of these people are taller than you, they all outweigh you, and they're all stronger than you. So you need to stop trying to go physically toe to toe with these guys, because you're getting hurt every time. And it's true, I was. And that was really good advice, actually. I kind of went, oh yeah, okay, yeah.
Why do you think you felt the need to go physically toe to toe with these guys?
This was my way of proving my worth, right? This was all tied up in trying to make sure that, hey guys, look at me. You don't have to be nice to me. You don't have to like moderate your language. You don't have to like treat me with kid gloves. I'm just as tough, just as hard, just as, I can get in there and tussle just like you guys can. And that's what I tried to do. I was kind of happy when that kind of world went away, when we stopped doing those things. It was good to come to the realization after about 18 months. It didn't really much matter, how enthusiastically I tried, and played all the mess games and everything else like that. It wasn't going to make a difference.
Okay, so working with your Canadian colleagues obviously brought with it a ton of challenges. Can you give us a sense of what it was like for you to work with coalition forces?
I actually found the further in culture, like the more culturally different they were, the more accepting they were of me. So I found the Greek and Turkish officers on the line. I had no issues with them. They were professional and polite and very courteous. The British officers and the American officers to work with on a professional basis were very difficult. They really struggled with me being there. And because I see it as, it wasn't, I don't think it was me personally, but it was more about representing change, right? You're representing a change that they're really, really not comfortable with. I had an American officer explain to me, sit me down and explain to me very seriously why I shouldn't be in the artillery, and how it could never happen in the US, because they actually like their women. They value the women. It was just like, so you figure Canadians don't like women?
I'm Catherine Rusk. Captain Nicola Goddard was my sister, and I'd like to make a request. Military service can bring great challenges and sacrifices. Women in particular can face unique issues. Help True Patriot Love and the Captain Nicola Goddard Fund support Canada's servicewomen, veteran women, and their families. True Patriot Love Foundation is a national organization that supports the military and veteran community by funding critical programs across the country. Please consider donating today towards their mission at tplgoddardfund.com. No donation is too small. On behalf of my family and the Captain Nicola Goddard Fund, we thank you for your support.
This episode is sponsored by Mike Durland. Mike has been a proud supporter of True Patriot Love since 2012, and we thank him for sponsoring today's episode on behalf of Receptivity. So you've obviously dealt with so much in being one of the first women in the combat arms in the Canadian Armed Forces. I'm wondering if you might have some advice for other women out there who may be trailblazing in their own fields and paving the way for future generations.
There's a price and there's a reward for paving new ground. And the best part about the reward is that, you know what, you don't have to conform to anybody else's expectations, right? You're making your way. So the artillery female mess kit, I wore it exactly how I wanted to. Who's going to tell me I'm wrong? No one, right? Like, it's like, yay, and I like this part, but I don't like that part. And I like this part, so I'll wear it. There's a reward to being the first, and that's not to be discounted. But there's also a price, and you do pay a price.
I don't think that I'm alone in wanting to thank you for paying that price for all women in the Canadian Armed Forces and across Canada. You've put up with so much over the course of your career, and I know that we've only heard a tiny fraction of the challenges you faced. I'm wondering how the challenges in the early years of your career impacted your leadership style down the road.
So in good ways and not as good ways. So one of the regrets I have is that as a leader, I had opportunities where I could have been much kinder to people than I was. Not weak, but kind. And I wasn't, because I was really afraid of being perceived as weak. And that was always something as my leadership developed, because I had that early experience that if I gave any quarter, I'd be immediately branded as weak. I had bronchitis, and I went out on exercise in the field, and finally became so ill, I had to go back in early. That marked my early years, quite, as someone who couldn't hack it in the field. Well, I had bronchitis, for God's sakes, Like, how is that a weakness? Anyways, I was afraid that people would perceive me as being weak if I was kind. And I didn't learn until probably much later on in my career. Actually, I could be kind to people and it wouldn't be perceived as weakness. It didn't mean being soft. It didn't mean being lenient, but you could still be a good leader without being completely, hard line, and to be kind, to be empathetic, and to listen. And it took me a long time to incorporate empathy and kindness into my leadership style and being comfortable with it.
Empathy as a part of leadership is something that's come up before in this podcast, especially in discussions of Captain Nicola Goddard. And I believe the two of you were actually friends. Is that right?
Yeah. Nick was one of my junior officers in the regiment. When I was the battery commander for A Battery, which is that small subunit that's a part of 1RCHA, the larger unit. She was one of the officers who worked directly for me. So I, was there. I mentored all my junior officers, but you meet somebody and you click, right? And I did. I clicked. She was funny and warm and smart and laughed at all my jokes, and not just like actually thought they were funny, which was great. Yeah, we just tell stories and talk about. I was always afraid that I'd put the fear of God in having children, because of course I had quite young children when I was commanding A Battery. My kids were 1 and 3 when I took over the battery, and so I was dealing with that, and all the fun and joy that goes with having toddlers and working full time with a husband that works full time. And I'll never forget we got deployed to fight the forest fires in BC in 2003. And it was a last minute deployment. Got called, and we were going 36 hours, and we were out the door. And my husband was in Bosnia on tour. And so I have a 1 and a 3-year-old at home. What do you do? So I called my parents, and they can make it up in 3 or 4 days. And I called a babysitter and a daycare provider and everything else, and patched together this thing. Went out to the local grocery store, bought a month's worth of food, stocked all in my house, packed all my gear. My kids are looking at me with like the big, little eyes, and they're like, "What the heck?" And it's just like, bye, and left. Well, obviously with the kids in care of someone else, but left. And I was gutted, just gutted. I felt awful. My kids have no idea what's going on. Dad disappears, mom disappears, Granny and Grampy are showing up eventually, but where's mom? Where's dad? And I was just that. And so Nick, actually on the plane ride as we were flying out to BC, sat beside me and told me about her own experiences where her parents were up teaching up north, and they were doing all this, and she sat there and she said, "They're gonna be fine, like, look at me, I turned out great." And I'm just like, "Oh yeah, you did turn out great." And I felt so much better. But she spent like the whole ride reassuring me about that. And I'm like the senior officer, and I'm supposed to be the one who's got it all together, and I'm not supposed to be the one who's going like, "Oh my God, I've just scarred my children for the rest of their lives," And here's this young woman who's 23, 24, just saying, "No, it's okay. They're going to be fine. I turned out fine. And me and my sisters, we were great," and all this. It was really, that just shows what a great person, she was such a good person.
Where were you when you found out about her death?
Oh, I was just flattened, just devastated. It was so hard. I still can't talk about it without choking up. I was at work. I got a call from a good friend in Shiloh, Dave Poss. He didn't want me to find out on the news, which was really kind of him. And I did not believe him. He told me, and I said, "No, you're wrong." Like, I was emailing 2 days ago with her. Like, we were just exchanging emails, like, 2 days ago. Like, how can that be? No. And then it sunk in, and I was just, it was really hard. It was really hard. But, she's gotten, I was fortunate. I met her family, and her family are amazing. Tim and Sally and Victoria and Kate and her husband Andrew are marvelous, marvelous people. And they have such generous hearts that they have this loss, but they embraced everyone who knew her and felt, she was just you know, it was really, they're really special people. And it was really so helpful to have them, embrace you and say, let's, you know, keep getting through this together.
What does her legacy mean for you?
Her legacy, or the impact on me, on my life, was basically making sure you don't know that you're going to die. I know that sounds stupid, right? Like, of course you don't know you're going to die, but like, you don't know when it's going to happen. And so you need to make sure you're living well right now. You know, you're doing all those good things right now, not waiting. Like, don't be looking around the corner or anything else like that. You know, it's not you only live once, but in fact, you need to invest in what's going on in your life. And it really reinforced for me how important having a good, strong family network really is. And so that's something I really focused on. So my husband and I did kind of a handshake agreement where neither of us would turn down a deployment to Afghanistan if we were tasked or if we were told to go, but we wouldn't seek one out either. And it wasn't because going to Afghanistan, but just because those separations and those time away from family is really a big hit. And we did do a 2-year one where he was in or 2.5 years actually, apart, living apart. And after that we said, no, never again. It's just not worth it. So family always has to come first. And that's kind of, not that I needed Nicola, Nicola's death didn't, but it really brought home the importance of that.
Thank you for being so open and sharing your experiences with Nicola with us. We all lost so much when Nicola was killed. Before I let you go, I'd like to ask what you feel the biggest challenge was that you faced in your lengthy career.
I think the biggest challenge that I faced, that was coming to the realization that, you know what, it really doesn't matter what I do, that there are a slice of folks out there who are never going to be okay with you being there. And it doesn't matter how much time has passed. It doesn't matter if the organizational culture has changed. It doesn't matter that, this is now relatively mainstream behavior. I think that was the hardest thing to come to terms with, because the thing is it's exhausting, right? To constantly being on your guard, to being in that defensive posture, and when you let it down, so I screwed up. I screwed up big time. And what was really a revelation for me was how many people took advantage of when I was down, when I was to give me a good kick while I was down. And how the people who I thought were my friends and who I thought would stand up for me, um, didn't participate, but didn't intervene on my behalf. And that was incredible, because these are people I've known and served with for 15 years.
Yeah.
And I thought we were friends. I thought, and I'd stood up for them. Or in my mind, I had stood up for them, or I would stand up for them. And maybe they didn't see it that way, but I saw it that way. And I found that was the hardest thing to continue to serve after that moment, to continue in the military. And I did, I stayed in for another, 13, 14 years, but I found it very difficult at the time, because I thought, it, and at that point, you're thinking, is it me? Like, is it me personally? Or is it, going back to that, you're representing something of change, or how does that work? And I don't know. I still don't know. Like, I don't know. People go, oh no, Anne, it's, it's not you. And it's like, I don't know. Like, I still don't know. I don't know if they didn't like me personally, or if this was a, an Anne thing,
Right.
or if it was you as you thing, and I found it really hard. I found it very hard.
How did you motivate yourself through that, like to keep going?
In all honesty, it was the people who worked for me that got me through that.
Yeah.
It was Nicola Goddard and Sonny Hatton and Andrew Nicholson and Howard Hann and Howie and all sorts of folks within who worked for me.
Mhm.
And it wasn't because they were cheering me on or doing anything special, but you know what? They made me feel like I was giving them something of value. So I was I was mentoring them, I was leading them, I was coaching them, and I was trying to make them better, and they appreciated what I was doing. And that was the sense I got from them. I that was certainly what I received back from them. And that's why RMC was such a great place to go to after that time, because it really, mentoring young people, helping them step off on the right foot, seeing young women who were going to be going into similar situations that I went into and helping them was huge, huge. And RMC 2005 was actually the first time I had a female peer.
Wow.
Like another woman at the same rank level, with the same experiences as I did. She was a naval officer, and it was and we were friends, and we met and we clicked, and it was like, yes. And that was amazing, So it was really, really, that's what got me through it. Like that's what got me to stay in. I was like, I think I'm going to get out. I don't want to do this anymore. This is really, really hard. I'm going to stick my 20 and then I'm out. And when I say stick my 20 it means I'll stay in for 20 years so I can get my pension, and I'll get out. And then I got my groove back. It was great. It was a really good experience.
And when you think about the future of the Canadian Armed Forces, how do you feel about it?
Oh, I think it's an organization that it still has some growing to do, but boy, we're so far ahead of other comparative organizations. And I have to say, it's so much more open, and it's getting more open all the time. And there are people in it pushing it to be open, to think different ways, to look at different experiences, to value stuff that doesn't come from the military. And that is a huge change. And people people now don't realize that, but it's such a huge change that, that we would look at other organizations going, hey, that's a good idea. Why don't we try that here? That's something that was not the case at all when I joined. And so I think the future for the Canadian Armed Forces, if it maintains this open space, this open to new ideas, it really embraces innovation going forward. I think we're going to be a very different organization over time as it evolves, but I think it's going to be a great organization, and will represent our country. That's the most important thing. We have to represent our country. We have to look like what the rest of the country looks like. We have to be a part of what the national fabric looks like. And that, I think, is where the Canadian Forces is on the right track too. We're not quite there yet, but we're on the track.
I think a lot of industries are facing this challenge, not just the Canadian Armed Forces, but hopefully our military is facing it head on. And my final question for you, Anne, is looking back, knowing what you know now, would you do it all over again?
Boy, I used to joke that you couldn't pay me $1 million to do phase training again. Like, you couldn't. Like that was a joke that we used to do, is like, oh, do phase training and get paid $1 million, or just not do it. And it's like, not do it, dude. I'm never doing that again. I lost 40 pounds in the first 5 weeks of phase training, and I wasn't heavy going in. Like I was like at 105, 106, 106 pounds. Like, it is like, like half of me now. No, not half of me, but you get my idea. It was like skinny, because all we did was run and push-ups and sit-ups and, oh my God, chin-ups. I actually was doing chin-ups then. It was like crazy. Anyways, people would go, yeah, lots of women do chin-ups and everything else. But, nonetheless, it was physically, mentally exhausting. It was just you never got a break. Would I do it again? So would I do the training again? I probably would. Are there things I would do differently? Yeah, of course. Would I do it again? Yeah, I think I probably, knowing what I do now, it's so hard. It's like, could I do it? I'd like to do a do-over, but I'd like to do it in this army, not the old army. Does that work?
But you helped create. But you helped create this army. The army today wouldn't be what it is without you.
Oh, I don't know about that, but I have to say, I think I would prefer the new army environment to do it. And I think, yes, I would do it without hesitation in the new army, because I think the possibilities and opportunities are just so brilliant there. Do I want to go back to the old army? No, thanks. That's not a path I want to tread anytime again.
Well, thank you so much for being so candid with us today and for being so generous with your time. It was great having you on the show.
Oh, no, well, thanks very much for listening to me. I appreciate the opportunity to chat, and it's been a lot of fun.
It was so great having Anne on the show today. Her story really highlights how challenging change can be. Her story also showcases how one person's career can really help organizations move forward toward becoming more inclusive and more progressive. And now I'm excited to announce that our guest for next week is Dr. Bonnie Henry, Provincial Health Officer for British Columbia. Dr. Henry served as a medical officer in the Canadian military for a decade after completing her medical degree at Dalhousie University. We discuss what it was like to grow up as the daughter of an Army major and the role kindness plays in her personal brand of leadership. She also shares a few great stories from her military days.
We'd be out in the middle of the ocean, and some of the things I remember are, stopping in the middle of the ocean between, we're going from Esquimalt here in the west coast to Hawaii, and stopping to have a swimming exercise. I always wore a life jacket because I'm not a great swimmer, but you're out in the middle of the ocean and you're thinking, okay, the closest land is a mile down. and the big swell would come and you wouldn't be able to see the ship, and you can really feel like just how far you could be in the middle of nowhere.
For Her Country is hosted by me, Shannon Busta. It is written and produced by me and Katrina Bolak. Our music is by Whiskey Wolf and Oceanic Piano. A special thank you to Catherine Rusk and the Goddard family and the team at True Patriot Love for their support throughout this project. And thank you to our episode sponsor, Mike Derland, on behalf of Receptivity. This project was produced with the True Patriot Love Foundation and the Captain Nicola Goddard Fund. True Patriot Love is Canada's leading organization that supports military members and their families. It administers the Captain Nicola Goddard Fund, which was started by the Goddard family to support women in the military in honor of Nicola. To learn more about this podcast and the great work of this organization, please visit forhercountry.ca and consider donating if you can.